The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth as Emil walked with his daughter along the winding trail by the river. The path was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. Lila, her thin frame wrapped in a patchwork coat that hung slightly loose on her, clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked along the way. Her hazel eyes darted from tree to tree, her youthful curiosity finding wonder in every shadow and beam of sunlight. "Papa, why does the water move so fast here?" she asked, pointing to the churning currents below. "It's the way the river bends," Emil replied, his voice warm but distracted. He glanced at the sun slipping lower in the sky. The day was fading, and the chill of the evening was beginning to settle in. Before Emil could say more, Lila stopped abruptly. "Papa, listen." He paused, tilting his head. It was faint at first, a high-pitched whimper, barely audible over the murmur of the river. Emil's brows furrowed as the sound reached him again, this time clearer, more urgent. "It's coming from that way," Lila said, pointing toward the old stone bridge ahead. The bridge, with its moss-covered arches and crumbling edges, had always held a sense of mystery for Lila. To Emil, it was a relic of the past, a quiet reminder of the town that once thrived here but was now mostly forgotten. "Stay close to me," Emil instructed, his tone serious but gentle. Lila nodded, her grip tightening on the flowers. As they approached the bridge, the cries grew louder, sharper. Emil's steps quickened, his protective instincts taking over. Beneath the shadowy arch of the bridge, the air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of moss and stone. "There," Lila whispered, her small hand tugging on Emil's sleeve. Beneath the bridge, tucked in a tangle of branches and debris, lay a small dog. Its fur was matted, a mix of dirt and wet leaves clinging to it. The creature was trembling, its large, fearful eyes darting between Emil and Lila as if weighing whether they were friend or foe. "It's so small," Lila murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She crouched down, her flowers forgotten at her feet. "Is it hurt?" Emil's sharp eyes scanned the dog, noting the awkward angle of its hind leg. A rusted wire trap had snared it, cutting into the flesh. The wound was raw and angry, the fur around it darkened with dried blood. "Careful, Lila," Emil warned as she edged closer. "It's okay," she whispered, her tone soft and soothing. She extended her hand slowly, palm open. "We won't hurt you." The dog's ears flattened against its head as a low growl escaped its throat. It was weak, but the fear in its eyes was enough to keep Lila cautious. Emil knelt beside her, pulling out the small multi-tool he always carried. "Hold the flowers back," he said. Lila scrambled to gather her bouquet, her eyes never leaving the trembling creature. Emil moved with deliberate care, his fingers steady as he examined the trap. The wire was old but sharp, biting deep into the dog's leg. "This will hurt," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. As he began to work, the dog cried out, its small body jerking against the pain. Lila reached out, her hand finding its head. "Sure," she murmured, her voice trembling but steady. "It's okay, little one. Papa's helping you." The dog's whimpers softened under her touch, its trembling lessening. Emil worked quickly, his hands deft despite the awkward angle. After what felt like an eternity, the trap gave way, the rusted wire falling into the dirt with a dull clink. "There," Emil said, his voice low but firm. The dog tried to move but yelped, collapsing onto its side. Emil frowned. "It can't walk like this." "Papa, we can't leave him here," Lila said, her hazel eyes pleading. Emil sighed, glancing at the darkening sky. They were still a good distance from home, and carrying the dog would slow them down. But the thought of leaving it here, injured and vulnerable, was unbearable. "All right," he said finally. He removed his coat, wrapping the dog gently but securely. The small creature didn't resist, its body limp with exhaustion and pain. As they made their way back up the slope, Lila stayed close, her flowers tucked against her chest. The weight of the dog in Emil's arms was light but burdensome, a reminder of how fragile life could be. The journey home was quiet, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional whimper from the dog. Lila glanced up at Emil, her face serious. "We'll take care of him, won't we?" "We'll do our best," Emil replied, though uncertainty lingered in his voice. When they reached their small cottage on the edge of the forest, the sky had turned a deep indigo. The soft glow of the firelight spilling from the windows welcomed them home. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the faint aroma of herbs drying by the hearth. "Lila, fetch the clean towels," Emil instructed as he set the dog down on the worn rug near the fire. Lila nodded, her small feet pattering across the wooden floor. Emil examined the dog again, this time with more care. The wound on its leg was deep, but it didn't appear infected. He cleaned it gently, the dog flinching but too weak to resist. "Here, Papa," Lila said, returning with an armful of towels. "Good," Emil said. He wrapped the dog snugly, creating a makeshift bed to keep it warm. The dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, its gaze meeting Emil's. For a moment, there was no fear, only a quiet gratitude that spoke louder than words. Lila crouched beside the dog, her fingers brushing its matted fur. "What should we call him?" Emil raised an eyebrow. "We don't know if it's a him yet." "Papa." Lila giggled, the first hint of laughter since they'd found the dog. "It doesn't matter. I think he looks like a Pippin." "Pippin," Emil repeated, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Lila nodded. "It's a strong name. He'll need strength to get better." "All right, Pippin it is," Emil said. The dog let out a soft whimper, its body relaxing for the first time since they'd found it. Lila leaned closer, her face soft with affection. "You're safe now, Pippin. We'll take care of you." As the fire crackled and the room filled with its warm glow, Emil watched his daughter with the dog. Her tenderness reminded him of her mother, a memory that both warmed and ached within him. He reached out, gently brushing a stray curl from Lila's forehead. "You did well today, my girl," he said quietly. Lila looked up at him, her eyes shining. "We did well, Papa." Emil nodded, his heart heavy and full all at once. In the stillness of that moment, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could heal wounds far deeper than they appeared. Pippin stirred slightly. His small body nestled into the warmth of the fire and the care of the family who had found him. And as Emil sat back in his chair, watching the scene unfold, he felt a glimmer of hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to embrace in years. As dawn crept into the sky, soft rays of sunlight seeped through the cottage windows, casting a warm, golden hue over the room. Emil stretched in his chair, his back stiff from the night spent by the fire. His eyes fell on Pippin, who lay curled in the blanket, breathing steadily. The dog's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed more peaceful than the day before, though the injured leg remained tucked close to its body. Lila was still asleep on the couch, her arm dangling over the edge, her little fingers twitching as if she were dreaming. Emil stood quietly, careful not to wake her, and moved to check on the dog. "Morning, Pippin," he murmured, crouching beside the small creature. Pippin opened one eye, his gaze meeting Emil's with a cautious but trusting look. The corners of Emil's mouth lifted into a soft smile. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The dog didn't respond, of course, but the way its tail gave the faintest wag made Emil chuckle under his breath. He stood and moved to the kitchen, where he poured water into a small dish and set about preparing a simple broth. It wasn't much, but it was gentle enough for a dog who likely hadn't eaten in days. The scent of the broth wafted through the air, stirring Lila awake. "Papa," she called groggily, rubbing her eyes. "Morning, sleepyhead," Emil replied. "I'm making something for Pippin. He's looking better this morning." Lila slid off the couch and padded over to Pippin, who perked up slightly at her approach. "Good morning, Pippin," she said cheerfully, stroking his head. "You're a brave boy, you know that." The dog let out a small whine, leaning into her touch. Once the broth was ready, Emil placed it in front of Pippin. "Here, boy. Try this." Pippin sniffed cautiously before lapping at the bowl, his small tongue flicking rapidly as he drank. Lila clapped her hands softly. "He likes it." Emil nodded, relief washing over him. "It's a good sign. But he'll need more than broth if he's going to heal properly." Over the next few days, the cottage hummed with quiet activity as Pippin slowly regained his strength. Emil tended to the dog's wound every morning, his careful hands ensuring it stayed clean and bandaged. Lila took on the role of caretaker, sitting by Pippin's side and whispering stories to him as she stroked his fur. As Pippin began to trust them more, his personality started to shine through. He would wag his tail when Lila approached, his small barks filling the once quiet home with life. His bond with Lila deepened, and Emile often found her laughing as Pippin nudged her hand for more attention or playfully nibbled at her shoelaces. One evening, as Emile sat carving a small figurine out of wood, Lila asked, "Papa, do you think someone left Pippin under the bridge on purpose?" The question caught Emile off guard. He set the carving down and looked at her. "What makes you ask that?" Lila shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "He seems so nice. Why would anyone hurt him?" Emile's jaw tightened, memories of his own past flickering to the surface. He had seen the cruelty people were capable of, the indifference that could leave someone, or something, abandoned and broken. "Sometimes," he began carefully, "people don't understand the value of what they have. They lose sight of kindness." Lila frowned, her young mind grappling with the thought. "But we found him, right? We can show him kindness now." Emile smiled, his heart aching with pride for his daughter. "That's right. We can." Days turned into weeks, and Pippin became a part of their little family. The dog's leg healed slowly but surely, and though he still limped, he no longer seemed burdened by pain. Lila took him on short walks through the woods, her laughter ringing out as Pippin trotted beside her, his tail wagging furiously. One afternoon, as they walked by the river, Pippin suddenly stopped, his ears perking up. He sniffed the air, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Lila asked, kneeling beside him. Emile followed Pippin's gaze and saw something glinting in the grass near the riverbank. He approached cautiously, Lila and Pippin close behind. As he got closer, he realized it was a collar, a faded, weathered piece of leather with a rusted buckle. Lila picked it up, turning it over in her hands. "It has a name on it," she said, squinting at the faint engraving. Emile leaned in, his brow furrowing as he read the name aloud. "Mac." Lila looked at Pippin, who was sniffing the collar intently. Do you think this was his?" "It's possible," Emile said, his mind racing. "Maybe someone out there is missing him." The discovery stirred something in Emile. He hadn't thought much about where Pippin had come from, only that he needed help. But now, the idea that someone might be searching for him opened a floodgate of questions. Over the next few days, Emile and Lila began asking around the nearby town, showing the collar to anyone who would listen. Most people shook their heads, offering little more than a sympathetic shrug. It wasn't until they visited an elderly woman named Marta, who lived on the outskirts of town, that they got a lead. "Max, you say?" Marta said, her voice raspy with age. She squinted at the collar before nodding slowly. I remember a dog named Max belonged to a family that used to live near the old mill. They moved away months ago. Said the dog ran off before they left." Emile's chest tightened. "Do you know where they went?" Marta shook her head. "Not far, I reckon. But I couldn't say for sure." As they walked home that evening, Lila was unusually quiet. "Are you all right?" Emile asked, glancing down at her. "What if they want to take him back?" she said softly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't want to lose Pippin." Emile stopped, crouching to meet her gaze. "Lila, if they are his family, we have to give them the chance to take him back. It's the right thing to do." "But what about us?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Emile placed a hand on her shoulder. "No matter what happens, we've done something good. We've given him a second chance. And that's what matters." Lila nodded reluctantly, wiping her tears. She glanced at Pippin, who trotted ahead, blissfully unaware of the weight of their conversation. As they continued home, Emile couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in his chest. He had grown to love the little dog as much as Lila had, and the thought of losing him was almost unbearable. But he knew in his heart that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, and sometimes it meant letting go. The days that followed were a mix of quiet reflection and reluctant preparation. Emile and Lila put up notices around town and left messages with a few local merchants who might encounter the dog's original family. The flyer, simple but heartfelt, read: "Found, small brown dog, answers to Pippin or possibly Max injured but recovering well. If this is your dog, please contact Emile and Lila at the cottage by the woods." Lila's heart sank every time she saw one of the flyers tacked to a post or pinned to a shop's notice board. She couldn't help but feel like they were advertising the end of something precious. Emile, too, found himself pausing at the sight of the flyers, his mind torn between hope and dread. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lila couldn't hold back her feelings any longer. "Papa," she said quietly, staring into the flames, "do you think Pippin would even want to go back? What if they didn't love him enough to look for him before? What if they didn't care?" Emil sighed, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've thought about that too, Lila. But sometimes, life takes people in unexpected directions. Maybe they didn't stop caring. Maybe they just couldn't find him." "But we did," Lila said, her voice trembling. "We found him when no one else did. Doesn't that mean something?" Emil reached over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It means everything. And no matter what happens, we'll always have that." Lila nodded, though her eyes were still filled with unshed tears. She glanced over at Pippin, who lay curled up on his blanket, the faint scars on his leg a reminder of how far he had come. She couldn't imagine their home without him now, his presence as much a part of their lives as the ticking of the old clock or the crackling of the fire. The following afternoon, Emil was out chopping wood when he heard the crunch of footsteps on the path leading to their cottage. He straightened, wiping his brow, and saw a young man and woman approaching, their faces cautious but hopeful. "Excuse me," the man called, holding up one of the flyers. "Are you Emil?" Emil nodded, his stomach twisting. "I am. Are you here about the dog?" The woman stepped forward, her eyes scanning the yard until they landed on Pippin, who was sunning himself near the steps. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled in her eyes. "Max," she whispered. Pippin's ears perked up at the sound of the name. He hesitated, his body stiff, as if unsure whether to trust what he was hearing. The man knelt down, his voice gentle. "Max, boy, it's us. It's been so long." Pippin's tail gave a tentative wag, and then another, faster this time. He stood, limping slightly, and took a few steps toward the couple. "Good boy," the woman said, crouching and opening her arms. "Come here, Mac." Lila appeared in the doorway, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. Emil placed a hand on her shoulder, his heart breaking at the look in her eyes. Pippin finally reached the couple, his tail wagging furiously as they wrapped him in their arms. The woman sobbed into his fur, while the man stroked his back, murmuring words of love and relief. "We thought we'd lost him forever," the man said, looking up at Emil. "Thank you. Thank you for saving him." Emil nodded, his throat tight. "He's a good dog. We were lucky to find him." The woman looked at Lila, her expression softening. "You must be Lila. Max is lucky to have had you take care of him." Lila didn't respond, her lips pressed tightly together as she stared at the dog. The couple stayed for a while, sharing stories about Pippin, Max, as they called him, and explaining how he had gone missing during a family trip. They had searched for weeks but eventually had to move, heartbroken at leaving without him. As the sun began to set, the moment came for them to take Max home. Lila knelt beside the dog, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur one last time. "I love you, Pippin," she whispered. "Be happy, okay?" Max licked her face, his warm tongue a small comfort against her tears. The couple led Max down the path, their gratitude evident in every word they spoke to Emil. Lila watched until they disappeared into the trees, her chest aching with a mix of pride and sorrow. That night, the cottage felt unbearably quiet. Lila lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Emil sat by the fire, his thoughts heavy. Eventually, Lila crept out of her room and joined him. She climbed onto his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Do you think he'll remember us?" she asked softly. "I think so," Emil said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "And I think he'll always be grateful for what we did." Lila buried her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking into his shirt. Emil held her close, his own tears slipping silently down his cheeks. Though their home felt emptier, it was also filled with the quiet knowledge that they had done the right thing. And in that knowledge, they found a small measure of peace. Emil and Lila's lives adjusted slowly to the absence of Pippin, or Max as he had been called by his original family. The silence in the house felt heavier, and the space near the fireplace where his bed had been seemed hauntingly empty. Emil tried to keep himself busy with chores, but he often caught himself glancing toward the door, half expecting to see the little dog trotting in after him. For Lila, the days were harder. She missed Pippin's soft snuffles as he slept, the gentle wag of his tail whenever she entered a room, and the way he would nuzzle against her when she felt sad. Every corner of the house held a memory, and she found herself talking to him out loud, even though he wasn't there. "Do you think he's happy, Papa?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "I think so," Emil replied, though his voice carried a hint of doubt. "He was loved before he came to us, Lila. We just gave him a second chance to find that love again." Lila nodded, but her heart still ached. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. A week after Pippin had left, Emil and Lila took a walk down to the bridge where they had first found him. The autumn leaves were falling, painting the ground in shades of gold and crimson. Lila walked slowly, her hand brushing against the rough bark of the trees as they passed. Emil stayed close, his gaze scanning the river below. They stopped in the middle of the bridge, leaning against the railings and staring out at the water. "This is where it all started," Emil said quietly. Lila nodded, her fingers tracing the grooves in the wood. "Do you think he remembers this place?" "I think so," Emil said. "Some places stick with you, no matter how far you go." As they stood there, lost in their thoughts, they heard a sound, a faint, familiar whimper. Lila froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Papa, did you hear that?" Emil straightened, his ears straining. There it was again, soft but distinct. They exchanged a glance before hurrying to the side of the bridge, peering down into the shadows below. "Pippin!" Lila called out, her voice trembling with hope. A small shape emerged from the underbrush, limping slightly but moving with determination. It was Pippin. His fur was a little scruffy, and his eyes looked tired, but his tail wagged furiously as he saw them. "Pippin!" Lila cried, scrambling down the embankment. Emil was right behind her, his heart pounding. The dog barked happily, his body trembling with excitement as Lila scooped him into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, burying her face in his fur. "What are you doing here, boy?" Emil asked, his voice thick with emotion. Pippin wagged his tail and licked Lila's cheek, as if to say he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Lila looked up at her father, her face a mixture of joy and confusion. "Why would he come back, Papa? He was with his family. They loved him." Emil crouched down, running a hand over Pippin's back. "Maybe he realized this is where he belongs. Maybe he missed us as much as we missed him." They carried Pippin home, their hearts lighter than they had been in days. Back at the cottage, Lila gave him a bath, scrubbing away the dirt and leaves from his fur. Emil warmed up some leftovers, which Pippin devoured with gusto. That night, as Pippin lay curled up on his old blanket by the fire, Emil and Lila sat nearby, watching him with matching smiles. "Do you think his other family will come looking for him again?" Lila asked hesitantly. Emil shook his head. "If they do, we'll figure it out. But for now, he's here. And that's what matters." The days that followed were filled with happiness. Pippin settled back into their routine as if he had never left, his presence bringing warmth and laughter back into the house. Lila took him on long walks through the woods, her laughter ringing out as he chased after leaves and barked at squirrels. Emil often found himself pausing during his work just to watch the little dog snoozing in the sunlight, a soft smile on his face. But there was still a question lingering in their minds. Why had Pippin come back? One afternoon, as Lila and Pippin played in the yard, Emil spotted a figure approaching along the path. It was the young man from Pippin's original family, his face etched with worry. Emil's stomach tightened as he stepped forward to greet him. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Hi," the man replied, his eyes darting toward Pippin. I think he ran away from us. I don't know why. We've been looking everywhere." Emil nodded, his heart heavy. "He's here. He came back to us a few days ago." The man's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you for taking care of him again. I don't understand why he left. We tried everything to make him comfortable." Emil hesitated, glancing over at Lila, who was watching them nervously. "Sometimes animals know where they're meant to be," he said carefully. "It's not always about what we do or don't do." The man looked at Pippin, who was now sitting by Lila's side, his tail wagging as he watched them. "He looks happy," the man said softly. "He is," Emil said. There was a long pause before the man nodded. Maybe this is where he belongs. He seems to have chosen you." Emil felt a wave of gratitude and relief wash over him. "If you're sure, we'll take good care of him." He'll always have a home here. The man smiled faintly, his eyes misty. I'm sure. Thank you for giving him what he needs. As the man walked away, Emile turned to Lila, his heart full. She was kneeling beside Pippin, her arms wrapped tightly around him. He's staying, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emile nodded, his smile wide. He's staying. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars shone brightly above, Emile and Lila sat together with Pippin nestled between them. The weight of the past few weeks seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of peace and belonging. For Emile and Lila, Pippin wasn't just a dog. He was family. And as they sat there, surrounded by warmth and love, they knew that no matter what challenges life threw their way, they would face them together, with Pippin by their side. And for Pippin, the little dog who had once cried under a bridge, it seemed that he had finally found his forever home.